Hi everyone, welcome to study session 16, which is reading 46. And you and I are going to have the pleasure of working through portfolio management together for the next 3 weeks. We are going to be adopting 2 readings per week. It's going to be nice and slow. We're probably not going to go all the way through for 2 of the 3 of them. We'll see how next week's reading goes, but I'm looking forward to having a little bit of fun with you. My name is Rob. There's my email address on the screen if you want to reach out if you've got any questions. It is the early start, so I doubt the questions will be coming through thick and fast, and there will be tuts given to you in next year's lectures. But if you've got any general questions or you just want to communicate about portfolio management in general, please do reach out. I just want to give a little backdrop about myself for the people that don't know. Hi, you new? No, you're not. Okay, you got it there. I'm going to keep asking because there's one person that's new and I've got a random file I need to give out. So a little bit of a backdrop about myself. I'm going to start with the big caveat. And the big caveat, ladies and gents, is that I have a confession. My confession is that currently I am a CFA Level III candidate. The reason why I'd like to clearly state that is because when I remember starting, a candidate that was a level ahead of me without completing took us for a particular module, and the general sentiment around this module was that people were not impressed. You're entitled to your opinion, but I'd like to ask for you to hold your judgment until the end of the course, and then, of course, meritocracy prevails. I'm going to press button. Hold on. There we go. Now, please, constructive criticism if you feel I have fallen short on that basis. Wesley, there we go. First class service, how's that, eh? Constructive criticism if you feel that I've fallen short of the standards that you expect for these modules, please do let Russ know. Improvement is required if necessary, and also don't want to rob you of the course that you paid for. Beyond my soapbox moment of confessions, why am I standing here? I, of course, have participated up to your guys' level in the program. I've also done a couple of other C designations, CFP, CIPM, SIFM, and I've just recently completed my Master's in Investment Management at UJ. So hopefully I can bring some value to the table for yourselves from an academic point of view. From a career point of view, I'm also an external assessor for the BCom Honors Investments Program module at UJ, so I'm quite comfortable being around the academics of it. I've also been lecturing with Edge for the past 4 years. And in my day-to-day practice, I head up research for a small discretionary fund management company. So hopefully we should have a lot of fun together. I'd like to take it beyond just the academics of it. Yes. How did I do in this? In which one? I know I failed it. I'm joking. In level two, I think I stand to be corrected. I'll pull it up again. Not that this matters, because I promise you, once you're out the exam, you forget a lot of it. But I think I scored in the top 5 percentile around the world for the people that wrote. I think. And for level 1, I got all except one above 75. So I hope, but that means that's all bullshit. That doesn't matter. Let's focus on this, and that's the important thing. So just a little bit of context for portfolio management for level 2. As you can see, I've just placed a couple of stars for everyone to have a look at. Quants, ethics, FRA, fixed income, equity investments, and portfolio management all potentially have the ability to give you 15% in terms of mark allocation for the exam. Now, the only difference is that this subject, and I feel like I've got the short end of the stick between ecos and portmat, because one, nobody loves ecos before they do the course. And secondly, portfolio management is the only one where a 15% allocation could also be a 5% allocation. The rest are at least 10%. So you know, in terms of your hedging of bets, you could probably go for it. Now, what did I have to do to pass level 2? Well, I had to put in a shit ton of hours. Let's not bullshit here, call a spade a spade. And for this particular module, I had a time tracker sheet and I recorded approximately 31 hours of my personal studying outside of class and outside of tests. So the beautiful thing is you've got a head start now. Early start, you can go and you can get to it. But whether 31 hours is a lot or a little for you, I'm not saying anchor to that point. I'm just gauging on my experience. Some people take longer. Not generally, I'm a slow learner, but some people are generally quicker. So budget accordingly. Okay. Now, just to remind everyone, the readings tonight aren't going to take a long time. I'm going to try give you some real-world application, but I very much know that you're not here for basically just real-world application like other business schools are. You're here to essentially get learning outcome statements and pass the exam. But nonetheless, when you want to pause, let's just do so. So we're going to tee off tonight the portfolio management process and the investment policy statement by having a look at the following. The portfolio perspective, ladies and gents, is just a lens that people look through. In reality, we're going to go through it in some detail. And just by the way, the relative importance of this in level 3, basically 45 to 55% of the exam is portfolio management. Okay, so if you give this good attention, you tee yourself up nicely for level 3. We're going to describe the steps of the portfolio management, but more importantly, we're going to have a look at the components. It is very theoretical. We're going to explain why we generate this investment policy statement, and I'll try and tell you how we do it in reality. It's not to say that this is the only way to do it, but as asset consultants, we spend a lot of time developing these things from scratch for other people. So, okay. Capital market expectations, probably one of my favorite things in the world. Asset class relative judgments. What do we expect from equity, property, bonds, cash, local, offshore? We're going to have a look at how we incorporate that into the investment policy statement. We're also going to contrast how we use that for the strategic asset allocation versus tactical allocation for investors. Okay. Objectives and constraints, I cannot tell you how important that's going to be. It's going to rear its head so many times, and it doesn't matter which tuition provider you go to for CFA. Everybody harps on objectives and constraints. And if you go to the back of your CFA provided textbook, I'm not referencing EdgeNote specifically, you'll see the relative importance that comes through for that. Investment horizon, okay, that's fine. And ethical conduct is all of one paragraph, so I think we're good to go. So, ladies and gents, let's begin. The portfolio perspective starts with this concept of diversification. And this concept of diversification, I say economics is the bright topics of investment, because you can talk about it, you can shoot the breeze with economics, but this is portfolio management's bright topic is diversification. Okay, and this is essentially what it purports. 1962 or 52, if I'm not mistaken, Nobel laureate Harry Markowitz essentially developed a way for us to quantitatively measure risk for portfolios and combine risk with return for portfolios. And essentially the concept of diversification says that there is going to be an enhancement of benefit for the portfolio as long as the assets are not perfectly positively correlated. That's a discussion in itself. I believe that the holy grail of assets is zero correlation or marginally negative, but nonetheless, we're going to expand your thoughts on this. Okay. Now, basically, the aim here is that these investments need to work together in such a manner that the payoff profile of each of these investments doesn't occur at the same time. Okay. Now, what this means is that for the discerning amongst us, you're specifically going to know that there's going to be a dog in your portfolio at one period of time. And you're going to go, why must I have the one that's not performing just for the sake of not betting the farm on something? And it's a humbling moment when you get it wrong in reality and you learn that that has to be the case. But nonetheless, as long as assets are less than perfectly positively correlated, there is some benefit for diversification in the portfolios. Now, this portfolio perspective, and we'll see later on, there's many developments in the field at the moment. I actually think the notes are a little bit behind, but nonetheless, it's too quick to keep up. We're going to see what risk gets priced in. And when looking at the portfolio, we make the assumption the only risk that needs to be priced in is systematic risk. Ladies and gents, this concept in of itself is generally just considered the market risk, the market beta. Okay, so what's on the other side of the fence, and why don't we consider it? What's on the other side of the fence is idiosyncratic, unsystematic risk. And the reason why we don't consider it, and theoretically it's not rewarded, is because it can be diversified away. So for example, I take a position in MTN, I have country-specific risk. I take a position in Judeco, I may have cyclicality risk. But the point is, you add enough of these up, and essentially you can diversify it away. And if you can diversify it away, we'll see how arbitrage comes into it a little bit later on when we move beyond this. Okay. So diversification is the accepted and expected way to reduce risk. You'll see for most of us in reality that that is a truism, but for some of the lucky of us in this room, we can probably use something like options as an additional way to transfer risk from one party to another. So this systematic risk in of itself is this funny thing that's left over after you take all the business-specific risk out. So what on earth is it going to be? And this question depends, the answer depends on who you ask. So one consideration is that what's left over is how macroeconomic variables just affect the stock market in general. Basically, you can say anything else that you like as long as it isn't company-specific risk. GDP growth rate, a general rate of interest in the economy, a foreign country growth rate. It doesn't matter. As long as this one single golden thread affects all investments in general, then it's systematic risk. And we're going to have a look later on as to how the economic market, technically next week, ties into the financial market. We'll see that there's 4 or 5 mechanisms. We call it a transmission mechanism, how they tie together. Okay. So ladies and gents, here's just some examples of essentially what can be considered the contributor to systematic risk. As long as you just understand it affects everything whether you diversify away or not. Okay, that's the principle. This concept over here is probably one of my most favorite concepts in the world. But when looking at maximizing the trade-off between risk and return, we always assess this on a portfolio basis. Okay, so that's why it's called modern portfolio theory. If you want to, afterwards, we can talk about these various quantitative models and building reality. I'm a firm believer that everyone should be able to do that. Okay, so we teed off now for a basic portfolio management process. But what is this process? And I can tell you that it doesn't sound sexy. And in reality, there's a large portion of portfolio management that in of itself isn't sexy. I can guarantee to you at this point in time that right now we are doing rebalances and trades across everywhere, and it is a pain in the ass. It's not fun and it's not sexy, but it's part and parcel of this. But we need to first begin with the planning phase. And ladies and gents, the planning phase is essentially the scoping session where you generate this document called an investment policy statement. Now, what this policy statement does is essentially it governs the relationship between you and the client. So if you want to go back and you want to ever see who did something right or wrong, have we met expectations or not? Because what is expectations? Is it what you written in the document, or is what your client is hearing about what their friends get around the bar? Okay, because it changes. So needs, requirements, and expectations, we're going to drill deeper into, but it's basically for level 3. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to have a look at the goals, constraints, and risk preferences. I cannot tell you how much that risk preferences and constraints is going to come up. We probably give it about a page or 2 in level 2, and it's about 3 readings in level 3. Okay. So this guide needs to be there so that future investments don't essentially wander to where the current market environment gravitates to at the time. Okay. Now, last but not least, we're going to learn that reviewing this regularly is partly your responsibility, but if anything is done in between, it's the client's responsibility as well. Why? Because it's not what you agreed to, It's what you agree to relative to the client's circumstances. And most often, if you guys deal with unit trusts or anything of that nature, this doesn't change. So we kind of have a hard time applying this to reality, but wait until you do a personal share portfolio or something of that nature where it's constantly adapting. Okay. Yes. Okay, so what I mean is that future investment decisions are not going to be dictated by where the market environment is at that point in time, i.e., you're not going to be fickle about just reacting to news that's around you at that point. Does that make sense? You're going to be guided to a true north by your compass that you set up originally. Because let me tell you, it's very easy to get suckered into something. Oh, now inflation-linked bonds are attractive after being knocked, but who cares? You're at 3% and you agreed to be at 3%. You can't go more. That's what I'm referring to. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I was just making up an example there. Go research it yourself. Okay. Not a fan of them, but anyways. Okay. So a policy statement in the portfolio management process is invaluable. It helps the manager understand the client's needs better, and it also helps the manager manage the funds better. Okay. To an unemotional standard. We'll see later on that this is important because without this document being in place, it makes the client less likely to leave the manager because all the tacit knowledge and process is up here. When if it's in a doc, the document can just be handed over to the next manager. Okay. The execution phase. It's over here where the fun stuff begins. This is where we spend a lot of time assessing the risk and return characteristics of anything and everything. If you're in the research division of a company, you go wherever you go. You read a newspaper, you speak to somebody, you know the asset class from a historical perspective, you know the asset, you go and you research and you compile information about the world around you. Okay. Now, the intention here is to make a capital allocation decision ultimately. We'll see whether that capital allocation decision falls into a strategic or a tactical basis, depending on the time horizon. Okay. Now, ladies and gents, this over here, the notes, and it does come from your CFA notes. By the way, apologies, there's a sentence that ends in mid-space. There's one more mistake in the notes, but I'll point it out to you. Okay, this perspective over here is more like a suggestion. It doesn't mean that it's the holy grail and you need to start from top down, but don't fight it too much if you've had experience in the market. Just go through what the notes say. Okay. So you want to identify the most attractive asset classes. And ladies and gents, you don't really need to know the asset classes separately insofar as next week we're going to be allocating risk premiums. And it's going to be quite an iterative, repetitive exercise where we're going to go step by step, adding them on through the process. Okay. And then afterwards you do the bottom-up analysis. But of course, in reality, this is done however it's done by the manager. The feedback phase. This is where my current love affair with the market stands at this point in time, is rebalancing portfolios. So any of you that in the room work for a LISP, Investex, Glaciers, Allen Grace, Stanlibs, you guys are going to give me gray hairs in a matter of a year. So thank you. But anyways, this is where the performance measurement and evaluation happens. And the feedback mechanism says, have you done your job or not? Okay. This is more tricky than you would think because, ladies and gents, without writing it down in this investment policy statement, it's very loose to discern whether you've done your job. Okay. Nonetheless, I'll give you one example just to tie it into reality. And this can be a matter of opinion or not. You take a value manager, for example. A value manager buys a cheap stock on a price-to-book basis. It doesn't matter what you consider, but it may take 5 or 7 years until their thesis generally on average tends to pay off. A growth or a momentum manager, by another chance, they get a feedback mechanism within 3 months. So I just want you to assess your strategy relevant to what that strategy tells you you should adopt. Okay. So, like we said, the investment policy statement sets the tone for the investor's needs, requirements, and expectations. Now, basically, why do we have to create this statement? And you'll see that generally, if you're creating products for a company, that statements like this tend to just be repetitive over time with only small changes at the margin happen. Ladies and gents, firstly, realistic investment goals. Let me tell you, I've spent a lot of time dealing with investors, with financial planners, with other financial market participants to only see unrealistic investment goals. Okay. The most famous recent example that comes to mind is essentially an individual that placed 10 million Rand into Bitcoin uh, using the short-term history as an expectation going forward. They lost 6 million of that 10 million Rand, and they cashed out before they lost them more. So this just helps frame an investor to a realistic expectation, and it's referenceable in the future again. Okay. Investors have selective hearing and memory, let me tell you. Okay. Common standards, that's quite a biggie. Ladies and gents, if I'm a value manager and I'm underperforming the market, am I doing a good or a bad job? Okay. Well, I need to be evaluated relative to my style. So once again, to set that standard in the beginning, it needs to be agreed to in the beginning, because let me tell you, after the fact, to try and agree to something to evaluate yourself against, you've never seen people argue and banter around a table like you do there. Okay, it can be easily implemented by the current or future investment advisors, and it will prevent short-term changes. Ladies and gents, I spent the last 3 years of my life researching this for my master's, and what I can tell you is that myopic loss aversion, you make a long-term decision and you evaluate it on short-term outcomes, is probably the demise of most investors out there. So an IPS goes a long way in helping you manage that. And this is the key one. And apologies, my page has cut it off, but I'm just going to add in investment guidelines. I hope yours hasn't. Now, the major components of an investment policy statement. You need to say why you're putting this document together. I don't know if anybody else in the room experiences this, but as investment professionals, you write and read for a living. Okay. So now, if you need to write something else, you need to be clearly aware of why you're going through this exercise so that you don't run into tangent. Description of the client's circumstances and objectives. Why circumstances? Because objectives or requirements are, I don't want to say fickle to what the investor feels at a point in time, but if you don't place the circumstances down there and the investor's circumstances change and they say, but this objective is not appropriate for me now, chances are they'll come back to bite you. And in South Africa, they have rights for recourse. Okay, there's an ombud in the country for small claims though, but anyways. Okay, duties and responsibilities of the investment manager and the client. Let me tell you that if you do not state an investment policy statement that we will once a year on our annual review ask you if this is still appropriate for you. And anywhere in between, the onus or the burden of responsibility falls on you to let me know, you may be in a world of trouble. Okay, because what do clients do? You're the last person on your mind nine times out of 10. Okay. Client's investment objective, ladies and gents, we're just going to essentially have a look at risk and return. Then we're going to break down constraints separately. Okay. Procedure to update the IPS, because if you don't put the mechanism through which you're going to go through this process, the process itself will change every year. I can guarantee you, we see this time and time again, is that the process is whatever people feel at that point in time is the best thing. Okay. Investment constraints, and we're gonna have a look at the LIT. Okay, but that's an easy way to remember the 5 constraints. Guidelines for adjustments and rebalancing. Ladies and gents, there's a strict way to do it and there's a loose way to do it. If it deviates or there's portfolio drift from a particular asset by 2.5%, 5%, whatever the case may be, we're going to rebalance back to target weights. No ifs, no buts, no worrying about it in between. The second is periodicity. We will rebalance to target weights every month to 5 to it works for you. Most people in reality I see don't have a hard and fast rule. They tell clients they have a rule to give clients comfort, but what happens in reality is there's always a constant assessment. Is this trade worth the cost of implementing the trade? especially for offshore domiciled investments. I can tell you the fees are unbelievable. And then investment guidelines. Okay, can we do this? Can't we invest in that? Benchmarking, very important, and appendices. Oh boy, are there appendices. And let me tell you, there's probably about 40 pages governing what you can charge a client. It's always amazing. Okay. So basically, it's all just a crutch at the end of the day to keep everything on the train tracks as it should be. Now, once you've done the hard yards, this is where the fun stuff comes in. And you can start doing all your fancy models and algorithms and your fundamental analysis, and you're chatting to strategists, and it's a rabbit hole. But the next step is to proceed with the strategic asset allocation exercise. So ladies and gents, how this is done in reality by a large portion of market participants is as follows. What you generally start off is with the state of the world. A state of the world is going to guide what you look at going forward. It's going to be your inputs into the process. Okay. The states of the world are going to be transformed via some method or another into something usable. Okay. This is probably going to be a Black Litterman, which is essentially the same as a mean variance optimization or a Monte Carlo simulation. We're going to have a look at the pros and cons of that. You can also do your CAPM estimates. You can do whatever you want as long as you transform the information to something that considers all the interrelationships of the assets. Once you do this, you're going to get your output, and there's always going to be a subjective overlay accordingly, i.e. does it conform in South Africa to Regulation 28 Prudential Investment Guidelines, i.e. is there any tilt to what's being implied by some of our models into this process. Okay. With the aim of eventually putting your neck out there and saying, I believe that the weight in this security should be 5% and not 7%. And then it comes down to semantics. Some people say if it's less than 2.5%, what are you doing with your time? Yeah, it doesn't matter. But the point is, it gets there. So we're going to have a look at the major asset classes, ladies and gents. But if you see here, real estate is not necessarily talked out there. There's a couple of papers that are coming out to say that it's a separate asset class. In your CFA notes as well, some reference it as it's its own independent asset class, and some don't even include it in their analysis. You'll see this section doesn't have it as a standalone thing. Okay. Alternative investments, whoever's working in this space, is quite interesting. We do have some involvement in venture capital funds ourselves at the firm, and let me tell you, it's quite a keen space to be in. So, ladies and gents, when you want to implement the strategic asset allocation, there's no right or wrong way to do this. But there is just a various number of ways out there that are generally communicated to investors and adopted. The first one, and there's a big trend towards this worldwide, is passive investment strategies. Now, ladies and gents, passive investment strategies are not just a pure buy and hold strategy. They're strategies that do not react to changes in capital market expectations. But I want to ask you this. How does a share price change on the stock market? Somebody is imposing their view onto this, and what you're essentially saying is that you trust the average view of all the other market participants in the economy to make the informed decision for you. The key word there is average. That's the operative word. Okay. Active investment strategies, ladies and gents, this is where you see we're going to have high tracking error, high active share, very different to benchmark stuff. We can essentially over and underweight relative to passive benchmark because we have informed opinions. Okay. I am of the believer that active investment strategies do exist. Okay. I don't run any in long-only listed markets myself, but I know that there are people out there that I believe can do it on average. It's just a small minority. What is essentially eating into that? This is the big space of the day. This is where the exciting stuff is happening. In semi-active strategies, okay, you can call these risk-managed strategies. You can call these enhanced indexation. You can call these smart beta factor investment series type product. It doesn't matter. What this is, ladies and gents, is that you're trying to do one of two things. You're trying to have a smart enhanced index process whereby it still tracks the index, That it makes smart, informed decisions, you hope, but to a limited band around this index, i.e., there's active decisions with a limited or low tracking error, but the fees are lower. It's generally an algorithm or a decision-making process. The other one over here is essentially factors, and we're going to have a look at this in some detail. This essentially says that if I know that my investment manager only buys quality companies where the ROIC is well above the rack and they screen everything else, what happens if I just do the same thing and equally weight everything that comes through my screen? Will that manager under or outperform that? And that's essentially what factor investing says. Okay. And there is a lot of people coming to market with this. If I was you, I would keep up to speed and go do some reading on it. Okay, what have I missed? I don't think I've missed anything. Here. The length of the investment or time horizon will have a large impact on the strategic asset allocation. I cannot tell you enough, I cannot stress enough that when you have a look at this page over here, what we do is we assess the Monte Carlo simulations on a rolling return basis so that the asset allocation matches our time horizon and that the shortfall probability is quite low. i.e., if you say I've got to invest for 3 years, but you put 90% into equity and 5% into bonds and cash, chances are that the volatility of a rolling 3 years means that 60% of the time you're probably not going to meet the hurdle rate. However, over 7 years, 95% of the time you're probably going to get to where you need to be. Okay. Very important consideration is the time horizon. We're going to link that back to an investor's ability to accept risk. Okay. So, very important point. I would note this over here, but if we have a look at investment objectives, ladies and gents, is that it is generally governed by the dynamic or the interplay between risk and return in investors' portfolio. What I can tell you is that risk generally guides the discussion around what the investor can or can't do, and you'll see that return follows suit. There's only a few instances where return leads the way. Okay, absolute investing, or where you're trying to get a return that you want versus a return that you require. And that depends on ability to bear risk. Okay, but nonetheless, we're going to start with risk because this is probably the more important one. The past, the history can't tell the future, but the future does rhyme with the history. And what you tend to see is that risk rhymes more. It tends to be on the same frequency more as it historically was. Okay, but we will get into that. I've got my own perspectives there. But nonetheless, ladies and gents, risk comes down to these 2 points. And we're going to see later on, or hopefully all of you are in level 3 next year, this willingness to bear risk is a massive section in of itself. But nonetheless, ladies and gents, I feel like all of this would be intuitive to you. What's going to dictate an investor's ability to bear risk? The longer the time horizon. Now, I want to ask you the following. Who here in the room, volatility or variance, who here believes that that's actually risk? Let's take a step back. What is risk in your mind? Huh? Instability. Okay. Instability. How likely I am to lose money? What happens if I tell you this? In the next year, you could probably lose 90% of your capital value. But if you don't touch your money for the next 40 years, you leave it with me, I'll make it all back and some more for inflation. Is that risk? Maybe if you need your money anywhere in between those 40 years. Okay, but if your time horizon is 60 years and you've got enough time to leave there, and you know your ending wealth level is going to be where it needs to be, it's technically not risk. Okay, now, volatility over here is the following. Why does an up and down price of a security equate to risk? If you need more volatility to get to a high ending wealth level, it's not a problem. The only problem is if you need to create liquidity in between that time horizon and you lock in a capital loss. Okay, that is essentially why a longer time horizon is required, so that there's more time to recover. It seems simple, but I cannot tell you, ladies and gents, on face value, If an investor comes to you 2 years in and you're in a venture capital fund and you've had a down round, okay, your A share round was 600 million, your B shares round is like 40 million, okay, and it's for the same proportion of this company ownership. And the investor comes to you and says, I want to exit in B round because I need some money. They've just gone from a 600 million value company to essentially less than a tenth of that, but they need the liquidity. Okay, but it can recover in the long term. The greater asset base versus liabilities, all this does, ladies and gents, is the following. It allows you more time to approach your liquid investments first before going to your illiquid investments. And secondly, the greater your asset base, we're going to see that there is a relationship called the intertemporal rate of substitution. It just basically says how much benefit or joy or marginal utility you get from consuming something in the future versus today. And that's what that helps with. Secure employment. Why, ladies and gents? Because what happens is the following. You go and see a financial planner, a CFP, and CFPs think they're the coolest thing ever because they know a bit about law, and they've looked at a financial plan 8 times in one day. And they say the following. You want the highest return, right? Yes. What does that mean to me? Well, if you go for a medium return, you have to contribute 10 grand a month. But if you go for a high return, you only have to contribute 4 grand a month. Which one are you going to pick? Will it be fine if I go for the 4 grand a month one? Yeah, of course, no problem. Okay. Could I afford the 10 grand a month one if shit hits the fan? That's what this one means. Okay. If it doesn't work out as planned, you've got the ability to top up from your savings. And then, of course, insurances, but that doesn't necessarily tie into what we're talking about. Okay. Willingness to bear risk. Ladies and gents, this is quite a contentious one, but nonetheless, it depends on the attitudes and the investors' beliefs. It depends on their market experience. It depends on the context of their environment and their general psyche at the time that they're having a discussion with you. So what generally tends to happen is there's companies out there that tend to offer these services to assess what investors should react and behave like. Okay. Now, what this is, ladies and gents, is that you essentially have a certain willingness to bear risk, because what you should find is that some investors are risk-seeking, some investors are risk-averse, and some investors are risk-neutral. And if you ask investors on a year-to-year basis, what you tend to see is that they behave differently through the cycle, through different investment markets. Okay, it doesn't stay static. When you need to reconcile things, when it becomes a bit tricky, and you'll see in level 3 what you need to do. Do you need to adapt? Do you need to educate? And that's a story for a later day. Absolute risk objectives. Ladies and gents, do you require an initial income of 6% per year with that income essentially staying static, growing at 6%? There's no reference to anything else in the world around it. Okay. You need to fund your liabilities for a defined benefit fund, and essentially you need to get 7% return per year. Okay, that's what absolute risk objectives essentially mean. It means that if I have a shortfall probability, what is that absolute number? I can only try and get this objective with essentially a 5% VAR of 2% of my portfolio, whatever that equates to, 10, 20, 50 million rand, it doesn't matter. It's with reference to nothing else. Okay, relative risk objectives. This is where you'll probably get most of your mandates, I believe. Please, can you outperform the Findy, or can you outperform the Cap Swix for me, net of costs, with a tracking error of maximum of 5%. Okay, that's generally what would tend to happen. And this is where the desired and required return tends to come into the mix. Desired and required returns depend on the context of who you're talking to. But the required return is the absolute minimum return that you would need to seek as part of your investment policy statement. And if the investor's got capacity or the ability to accept additional returns and risk, that's when you go into the desired return territory. Okay. This is broken down into different tranches in level 3, but for the time being, it's as basic as that. You only need to know that your job is to not underperform the required rate of return. Okay, investment constraints. Ladies and gents, if you just order this a little bit differently, it gives you a word or an acronym or a homonym or whatever you call it, I don't know, that you can pronounce a bit better and you can hopefully remember. But this is what's generally in the appendices of an investment policy statement. Now, liquidity needs. Perfect liquidity need will be you run a family office, you deal with high net worth investors, and these high net worth investors say that in 3 years I need to cater for education because I want my lecturers of the business school to be great. I want to send them all to London Business School. We can only hope. But anyways, so I need to make 50 million rand available because you pay out if you ask for it. Okay? When does that need to happen? 3 years from now. You can't invest in something that's essentially going to create the requirement for cash flows in year 5, 7, and onwards. Time horizon, ladies and gents, that ties into the one before it, because liquidity, the ability to convert something into cash at close to fair market value very quickly, the quickly is dropped, and then the time horizon is what matters. If there's no time horizon requirement, you can wait for 50 years. Essentially, your quality needs essentially drop down. Okay. If it will eventually recover, there's no problem at all. Okay. Ladies and gents, what's a more stringent assessment here? Whether something is required on a short time horizon or a longer time horizon. And if you say short, chances are you're probably going to be fine with this section. Okay. Tax issues, there is a large amount of constraints for investors to say that I do not want to trigger a capital gains tax bill beyond a certain value because I then need to extract more money out my investment to pay for it. Okay. What you'll often see is in South Africa, if you manage what's called discretionary investments, non-retirement, non-compulsory money, and you manage it in what's called wrap funds or on a segregated mandate basis, you tend to not be able to trade into what you want because investors tend to want to hold back not to pay the capital gains tax bill. So you need to, as a financial professional, build some sort of calculator to say, well, what's the expected benefit? What's the expected loss? Let's do the opportunity cost comparison and see in the long run what results in the best outcome for you. That's the educating part of our jobs. Legal and regulatory forces, ladies and gents, I think in our country, and please excuse me, I don't know enough about the States, because we're not allowed to invest in the States, at least directly as South Africans. But in South Africa, our biggest constraint here from a legal standpoint is probably what's called Regulation 28. That essentially governs how much we can allocate to certain types of asset classes. That's one example. Okay. Another one is if we take large amounts of money offshore through a collective investment scheme or anything like that, we may need to get approval from the Reserve Bank. For instance, if you do an extremely large asset swap that uses up a company's allowed ability to take money abroad. Okay. And unique needs and preferences. I think the most common that I see over here is social investing, ESG. That's quite a big one. The ability that individuals would like to make their money, but in a socially responsible manner. Another thing that's also unique needs and preferences is if essentially you are of a certain religion, you can't make money from certain places. You can't charge interest. Okay. And essentially, you may need to invest in a product that's Sharia compliant, for example. Okay. That's unique needs and preferences. What's right or wrong? It doesn't matter. It's what's applied to each individual investor. Okay. Let's just have a look at this. We are approaching the end. The next couple of pages are going to go quite quickly. But there's just some examples of liquidity needs. That's fine. We've talked through it. Time horizon, ladies and gents. It all comes down to the ability to absorb risk in that regard. I.e., what you'll see is that investor that are young, starting their investments, have a very different asset allocation to somebody that may be 3, 5, 2 years away from retirement, whatever the case is. Sure. Yes. You have the ability to absorb risk. Tax issues, ladies and gents, you're going to look through that in some detail in level 3, especially when it comes to estate planning. I know there's estate planning in CFA. It's a bit crazy, but anyways. We're going to skip through the tax issues nonetheless. It gives you some color or context to the discussion, which I think you have. Ladies and gents, like I mentioned, regulatory considerations, IRAs, which are essentially retirement accounts in the States, as far as I'm aware, have certain considerations around them. Think of also tax-free investments. In South Africa, you can't charge a performance fee on a tax-free account, for instance. There's just another example about what a manager needs to consider. And unique preferences we spoke about. But let's have a look at this table over here to compare now how different market participants have different varying requirements. So let's start with an individual. The investment purpose could be any reason, ladies and gents. You want to save up for an equity stake purchase in your business. You want to put your kids through school. You want to retire. You want to go on a holiday. You want a car deposit. It doesn't matter. Whatever the investor comes to you for, that's what you're going to invest for. The risk tolerance is very investor dependent. I can guarantee you that as much as we all think we may or may not be similar, when each of us completes some sort of questionnaire, it's going to be different. Okay, whether it's psychometric risk, it doesn't matter. Okay, risk tolerance, time horizon, liquidity, it all depends. There's no hard and fast rule. Where these hard and fast rules starts coming in is different participants. Okay, like you'll see endowments. Endowment is just a structure that pays tax separately, that has its own rules and institutions, and that serves a purpose. It's very similar to our foundation. But generally what you'll see is that most endowments, at least not in the South African context, are there to provide ongoing financial support to institutions. So you'll see the Harvard, the Yale endowment. What that does is that will fund future student bursaries. It will fund future developments to the campus, future R&Ds, research papers, conferences. That's what it's there for. And the risk tolerance is high because that money is never going to, in theory, be used at least on a capital basis. Okay, what are we going to do? We're always going to fund out a certain proportion of the proceeds that these assets generate. Or if we're very lucky, the new contributions into the endowment fund can just be directed straight towards a cause without even having to touch the assets. Okay, that's why it's long. So that means that the liquidity liens are low. The need to convert something to cash at a market-related value quickly doesn't exist. Okay, think of trying to, the most obvious thing that I have in my career trying to do this with is the African bank experience with the curatorship and essentially the subordinated loans. You got stubs. You got these little tickets that said you have some right to something and it may or may not be left over. You try to sell those things, you probably sold it for 5 cents in the rand or something stupid. Okay, most people didn't even value them on their balance sheets. They just kept them there. So unit trusts looked like heroes when they eventually sold them. And someone in London was buying lots of them. But the problem is you could not sell that thing for the 1 rand. I can guarantee you. Income requirements, it doesn't matter. Okay, foundation, same thing over there, ladies and gents. High risk tolerance, long-term time horizon. You get the feel for it. Okay. So let's move on to something that has a little bit more context applied to it. And please excuse me, I'm not a Basel expert. I don't work in a bank. I don't know exactly what the capital adequacy requirements are on risk assets, and so, but nonetheless, I'll try to give you some flavor for it. Banks, ladies and gents, essentially what you'll see is that when it comes to their risk-taking requirements and their liquidity requirements, what you'll tend to see is that their risk ability is low and their liquidity requirement needs to be quite high, and it needs to be accessed on a short-term basis. Why? Because not only the more risky the assets, the greater the burden from a regulatory point of view that they need from a capital adequacy point of view. But if I'm a depositor at the institution, they need to be able to pay me my money when I come and I try withdraw it from the institution. Insurance companies are slightly different, ladies and gents. What you'll see is that there's an insurance arm of the world that essentially is a casualty, property, indemnification type insurance. That type of insurance essentially doesn't have any direct bearing on the financial markets. So you can take a little bit of more risk there. But what you tend to see is that life insurance, i.e. or medical insurance, may to some degree be affected by the market to a larger degree in terms of its correlation to it. Okay. Now, what this is, ladies and gents, is that there we go. The time horizon depends on the nature of the requirements of the liabilities of these institutions. Simple as that. And once again, it just depends on the particular institution and how good the actuaries are in getting cash flow in while still getting business in. Mutual funds, which in South Africa are unit trusts, and this is my baby, but nonetheless, where you can invest depends on what your mandate allows you to invest in. So if you're a property fund and you go try to buy some bonds, I promise you, you're going to get fined and have your license taken away. And everything there on out depends on the fund, except the liquidity. The liquidity of these things, ladies and gents, needs to be high. Why? Because you as a unit trust need to guarantee redemptions on a daily basis to your investors unless agreed otherwise, i.e. weekly, monthly, doesn't matter. You'll see some riffs and quiffs hedge funds on a quarterly basis or monthly basis. Okay. Good to you. Sovereign wealth funds, defined benefit funds, ladies and gents, you can once again see that it's contextual to what the requirement of the fund is. Okay, there's a couple of managers in South Africa that have sovereign wealth fund allocations. There's one just down the road, there's one in Cape Town, and a large other number of managers. But defined benefit plans, ladies and gents, you learn from accounting, you've done this. This is essentially where you just guarantee a benefit to your employees. And what this means is that you guarantee the benefit to them when they retire. So, what's your time horizon is going to be long. What's your liquidity requirement going to be long. Chances are you're going to do some asset liability modeling here. You're not really going to be too concerned with anything else. Okay. Why age dependent? Because what you'll see is actuaries have a look at mortality tables, the average age of death, what the current age of the book is, what the expected contributions and growth rates are, and they do things that I don't know how to do. Okay, so that's my only context. So ladies and gents, just to end off that section in this reading, and then we'll take a break, is what is the main point of this reading? Firstly, you have the objectives of the investor, the risk and return objectives. This is probably going to be the biggest overarching guidance to the investment policy statement. And what you'll find is that risk tends to precede the return discussion. Okay, you really do need to remember these. However, and I prefer to just order this as LUTT, so I just remember it easier in my mind. But when it comes to the 5 constraints, so the 2 objectives, the 5 constraints, what you'll see is that the time horizon is important. The longer the time horizon, the ability to ride out shocks in the interim, so the more risk you can take. Okay. Taxes. Ladies and gents, taxes are a constraint, i.e. if you generate income, you need to pay a certain tax. So you may need to compare that return net of tax if another avenue doesn't pay tax. The most obvious example I know that comes to mind is a corporate versus a municipal bond in the States. For example, okay, the yields are low on munis, but you don't need to pay tax, or as high, I think. Okay. Legal and regulatory, we've spoken about that, Regulation 28 in South Africa. Liquidity, if you need liquidity soon, you need to be able to convert it to cash at fair market value quickly. And then unique preferences, that could be ESG investing, or whatever the case may be. Okay, the last learning outcome statement over here, basically, ladies and gents, we have a massive ethical burden that is upon us. And I cannot tell you, being in the venture capital space, being in a space where there's performance fees levied on funds, okay, is I promise you, you will see stuff out there that's borderline. Now, I'll give you one example and then we'll end off and we can take a break. Basically welcome just as we start the break. But anyways, Here's one example about an ethical dilemma that managers have. And a manager can decide to choose where to levy fees at certain levels to the investor. And any level that disadvantages the benefit of the investor to transfer that surplus to themselves is very easily done and could, of course, be labeled as acceptable in the industry because everyone else does it. So I'd just like to implore you, and it's bloody hard. Let me tell you, I've walked a fine line myself. I'm not going to stand on the soapbox here. But we just have this trust and this responsibility that's given to us, and we need to use it wisely.